Nora Callister spent 22 years building a career that was never truly hers to keep, giving everything she had to a company that had been quietly deciding, for longer than she knew, that she was expendable. On the coldest Monday of December, she was handed a termination letter, walked out of a building she had entered every morning for over 2 decades, and sat in her car in the parking lot for 11 minutes before she could make herself drive. She had no plan. She had a tank full of gas, a father's lakehouse key on her keychain that she had not used in 3 years, and the kind of hollow clarity that arrives when everything you thought was stable reveals itself to have been standing on someone else's terms. She drove north, 6 hours to Hayden Lake, Idaho, through the gray afternoon and into the early dark of a December evening, with the radio off and both hands on the wheel and the particular silence of someone who is not yet ready to think about what has just happened but is already, without knowing it, moving toward what comes next. What she found when she turned onto the gravel road that led to her father's lakehouse was not the dark and empty structure she had expected. There was smoke coming from the chimney, and what that smoke meant, what it led her to, what had been waiting inside that house and underneath the frozen ground of her father's property, would prove that Edmund Callister had understood something about his daughter's life that she had not understood herself. You will not believe what Nora found inside that lake house, and you will not believe how long someone had been waiting for her to never come back. If you believe that the worst endings are sometimes the only doors to the right beginning, subscribe to this channel right now and join our community. Every week, we tell the stories of women who discover that what was taken from them was never the thing that mattered most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Nora had started at Hale and Drummond Associates in the February of her 31st year, which meant she had given the company the entirety of her 30s, all of her 40s, and the first 3 years of her 50s, a span of life that contained, when she thought about it honestly, the bulk of what most people would call their prime. She had not thought about it that way while she was inside it. That was not the kind of thinking that the pace of Hale and Drummond encouraged. The company moved quickly, demanded continuously, and rewarded the particular personality type that did not slow down long enough to take inventory of what the movement was costing them. Her father, Edmund, had noted this about her when she was young, not critically, simply observantly, in the way he noted most things, with the quiet precision of a man who paid attention to the people he loved and trusted that the attention itself was a form of care. Victor Hale was 63 years old and had the particular quality of a man who had built his professional identity entirely on the labor of people he had convinced to believe in the institution more than in themselves. He was charming in the way that certain men of his generation were charming, with the ease of someone who has never been required to account for the gap between what he projected and what he delivered. He called people by their first names. He remembered birthdays. He had, in Nora's presence over 22 years, said things to her that she had internalized as evidence of being valued, things she understood now, with the cold clarity of the December parking lot still fresh in her memory, as the careful maintenance of someone whose usefulness he intended to extract for as long as possible and discard at the moment of maximum convenience for himself. The termination had come on a Monday. This detail struck her later as significant, not because Monday had any particular meaning, but because she had come in that morning with the same intention she had brought to every Monday for 22 years, which was simply to do the work, and the contrast between that ordinary intention and what the morning had actually contained had a quality she would spend some time processing before she could set it down. Victor had called her into the conference room at 9:45. His attorney was present, which she noted and cataloged without reacting to. There was a document on the table. The document described a restructuring of the company's operational divisions, a consolidation of her department into a new structure that, as she read carefully, did not contain a role for her. Her position was being eliminated. The company was grateful for her 2 decades of service. There was a severance package. There was an NDA. There was a pen. She read every page. She asked 3 questions, each of which was answered with the careful language of people who have rehearsed for exactly the question she was asking. She did not sign the NDA. She said she would need to review it with her own attorney. Victor's attorney noted this with a neutral expression of someone who had expected it. Victor himself said nothing after the initial explanation, which she also noted. She collected her personal items from her office, which took less time than she would have expected, because she had, over 22 years, brought surprisingly little of herself into that space. A photograph of her father at the lakehouse, taken the summer before he died. A small ceramic mug she had bought at a market in Portland on a work trip 8 years ago. A book she had been meaning to finish for 6 months and had not finished because there was always something more pressing. She put these 3 things in her bag. She left everything else. She drove out of the parking structure at 11:15 and sat in her car on the street for 11 minutes. She was not crying. She noted this with the same detached observation she had noticed her own steadiness in other high-pressure moments, as though part of her was always watching from a slight remove, cataloging the data of her own responses. She was not crying because something too large had happened for the ordinary release of tears. Something had shifted. The architecture of the last 22 years had rearranged itself in the space of a single morning, and she was sitting in the rubble of it, very quietly beginning to understand that the rubble was not the end of the story. She thought about the lake house. The key was on her keychain. It had been on her keychain for 3 years, since the last time she had been there, the summer after her father died, when she had gone up alone for a weekend to close it properly for the season and had ended up staying for 4 days without fully deciding to. She had not been back since. There had always been a reason. The distance was 4.5 hours in good traffic, 6 in December. The house had been standing empty. She had told herself she would get up there in the spring, and then in the summer, and then she had simply stopped making the promise because it was easier than continuing to break it. The way it does at that latitude in that season. The light draining from the sky before 4 o'clock and leaving the highway lit only by headlights and the occasional glow of a gas station or rest stop. She drove through it without stopping except once for gas and coffee. The coffee in a paper cup that she finished in 40 minutes, and that was not good, but was warm and gave her hand something to do. Edmund Callister had been at ease with himself in a way that Nora had spent 22 years trying to replicate through professional achievement and had not managed. She understood this more clearly now, driving north in the December dark, than she had understood it at any point while she was inside the achieving. She turned off the highway onto the smaller road that ran along the eastern edge of the lake, and the familiar geography of the route began to return to her the way childhood geographies return, not as recalled information, but as physical knowledge, the body remembering the turns before the mind has consciously registered them. She knew this road. She turned onto the gravel track at 8:47 in the evening by the clock on the dashboard. The headlights swept across the tree line and then across the front of the house, and she saw it before she had fully processed what she was seeing. A light in the front window, and rising from the chimney, clearly visible against the dark December sky, a column of smoke. She sat in the car for 4 minutes. She counted them, not deliberately, but because her mind had defaulted to the kind of precise, methodical attention it always defaulted to under pressure, the same quality that had made her valuable at Hale and Drummond for 22 years, and that now, in the dark of a December evening at the edge of a gravel track in northern Idaho, was doing what it always did, which was to organize the available information before committing to an action. The available information was this. The house belonged to her. It had belonged to her father, Edmund Callister, for 31 years, and had passed to her at his death 3 years ago, cleanly and without complication, because Edmund had been a precise man who had arranged his affairs with the same quiet thoroughness he had brought to everything else. The property was hers. No one had any right to be inside it without her knowledge. And yet someone was inside it, had built a fire in the stone fireplace that her grandfather had laid by hand in 1961, and was sitting in her father's house on a December evening as though they had every right to be there. She thought about calling the police. She took her phone from the console and held it for a moment and then set it back down. The smoke was not the smoke of something wrong. That was the thing she kept returning to. It was steady and calm and domestic, the smoke of someone warming a space, not the smoke of a break-in, not the smoke of something chaotic. Whoever was inside had been there long enough to build and tend a fire. They had not broken anything she could see from a car. The window light was low and warm, A lamp, not an overhead, the light of someone settled in for the evening. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately, the specific cold of northern Idaho in December, which was different from the cold of Spokane in a way that was not merely a matter of degrees, but of quality. The cold here carrying with it the presence of the lake and the pine forest and the elevation, a cold that was dense and clean and that she had forgotten, in her years away, how much she had always loved. She stood beside the car for a moment and let it settle around her. Then she walked toward the house. She did not go to the front door immediately. She went to the side of the house first, to the window her father had always called the kitchen window, the one that looked out from the sink over the dock and the lake beyond, and she looked in. The kitchen was lit. A single overhead light, the old fixture her father had never replaced because it worked, and he saw no reason to change what worked. At the kitchen table, with a mug in both hands and a book open on the table in front of him, sat a man she had never seen before. He was older, somewhere in his mid-70s, she would have guessed, with white hair and the particular posture of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical work and carried it in the set of his shoulders. He was reading. He was not doing anything alarming. He was simply sitting at her father's kitchen table with a mug of something hot and a book, in the way of someone who had been sitting at that table for some time and intended to continue sitting there for some time more. She stood at the window for a moment. Then she went to the front door and knocked. The sound of movement inside was immediate. Not startled movement, not the movement of someone caught doing something they shouldn't be, but the deliberate movement of someone who had heard a knock and was going to answer it. She heard footsteps crossing the front room, heard the particular creak of the third floorboard from the door that had been creaking since she was 7 years old and that her father had always meant to fix, and then the door opened. The man looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. That was the first thing she registered. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been expecting her, not tonight specifically, not at this hour, but in the general sense of someone whose arrival had always been a matter of when rather than if. He said her name, not Nora, her full name, Nora Eleanor Callister, the name on her birth certificate, the name her father had used when he was being precise about something, the name that almost no one alive still knew to use. She stared at him. The cold was at her back, and the warmth of the house was coming through the open door, and the fire was visible behind him in the front room, burning steadily in the stone fireplace. And the smell of the house came out to meet her, wood smoke and pine, and the particular smell of her father's house that she had not smelled in 3 years, and that arrived now with the force of something that had been waiting. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was steady. She noted this. He stepped back from the door. He said, "You should come inside. There are some things your father wanted you to know." And he had been waiting, he said, for 3 years to tell her. She stepped inside. The decision was not impulsive. Nora Callister had not made impulsive decisions since she was 19 years old and had learned, through a specific consequence she did not need to revisit, that impulsive decisions were almost always a way of avoiding the harder work of thinking clearly. She stepped inside because she had assessed the available information and had concluded that the man in the doorway was not a threat. He was old and calm and had known her full name and had spoken it with the particular weight of someone carrying something they had been asked to carry for a long time and were ready to set down. She stepped inside because the house was warm and the cold was at her back, and because something in the quality of the moment had the unmistakable feeling of something that was supposed to happen. The front room was exactly as she remembered it. This stopped her for a moment, just inside the door. She had half expected the house to have been altered, rearranged, marked by whoever this man was and however long he had been here. But it was not altered. Her father's armchair was in its position by the window that faced the lake. The bookshelves along the north wall held the same books in the same order. She could see the spines from where she stood and recognize them the way you recognize things that were part of the furniture of your childhood. The round braided rug her mother had made was still centered in front of the fireplace. Its colors faded now to a softness that was different from, but not lesser than what had been. The fire in the stone fireplace was burning with the steady, well-managed burn of someone who knew how to build a fire that would last. The man had moved to the armchair, but had not sat in it. He stood beside it with his hands at his sides, giving her the room, she understood, to take in the space at her own pace. This consideration registered with her. It was the consideration of someone who had been told something about her, who had been prepared for her arrival by someone who had known her well. "My name is Walt Pruitt," he said. "I own the property directly north of this one for 26 years. Your father and I were neighbors for the last 18 of those years." He paused. "We were friends. Good friends. The kind you don't have to explain things to." She looked at him. She had not heard her father mention him, but this did not surprise her. Edmund Callister had not been a man who talked extensively about his friendships. He had been a man who maintained them with the same quiet consistency he brought to everything, without announcement or elaboration. "He asked me to stay here," Walt continued. "After he passed, I mean. Not permanently. But he asked me to come up in December of each year and keep the place from going cold. He said he didn't want the pipes to freeze, and he didn't want the house to feel abandoned." He stopped. "He said he had a feeling you'd come back when you needed to. He wanted to be ready for you when you did." She looked up. Her father had left her something. Her father, who had arranged his affairs with the quiet precision of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to be done and had done it without drama, had left her something that required a neighbor to hold for 3 years and deliver in person, inside the house, on the occasion of her return. She understood, sitting on the boot bench with the fire at her back and the smell of the house around her, that her father had known she would come back. He had not known when. He had not known under what circumstances. But he had known, with the particular knowledge of a father who has paid close attention to his daughter for 53 years, that she would come back when she needed to. And he had made sure that when she did, she would not find an empty house. Walt left the room and returned with a wooden box. Not large, roughly the size of a shoebox, but heavier, made from the same cedar her father had used for the dock railing he had rebuilt when Nora was 12, a project she had helped with over 2 weekends in August, learning from him the patience of working with wood, which was the patience of working with something that had its own nature and required you to understand that nature before you could work with it effectively. She recognized the wood. She would have recognized it anywhere. Her name was on the top of the box, written in her father's handwriting, which was small and precise and slightly forward-leaning, the handwriting of a man who had written everything by hand and had cared about the legibility of what he wrote. Nora Eleanor. Not her full name. Just those 2 words in the handwriting she had been reading since before she knew how to read. She sat with the box in her hands for a moment without opening it. Walt had moved to the kitchen with the quiet tact of someone who understood that what was about to happen was private. She could hear him at the stove, the sound of water being put on for something, the small domestic sounds of someone giving her space without leaving her alone. She thought about her father. She thought about the kind of man he had been, which was the kind of man who built dock railings with his daughter on August weekends and maintained quiet friendships over 18 years with a neighbor he had never mentioned by name and arranged with that neighbor to keep his house warm in December in case his daughter needed it. She thought about the quality of that love, which was not the love that said, "I love you" at every opportunity, but the love that built things and prepared things and trusted that the person it was built for would find their way to it. She opened the box. Inside, resting on a folded piece of cloth that she recognized as a section of the flannel shirt her father had worn every winter of her childhood until it was too worn to wear, that he had apparently saved, were 4 items. A letter in an unsealed envelope with her name on it. A folded document that looked legal in nature, formal paper, precise type. A small brass key she did not recognize. And beneath all of these, a photograph she had not seen before, her father and a man she did not recognize, standing in front of what appeared to be a building she did not recognize, both of them looking not at the camera, but at something to the left of it, with expressions that were serious and focused, and that told her, without any other context, that the photograph had been taken at a moment that mattered. She picked up the letter first. Her father had always been a man who believed in the right order of things. He had left the letter on top. She would read it first. She unfolded it. Her father's handwriting, small and precise and forward-leaning, filled one side of the paper and continued onto the back. She read it once from the beginning, and then she read it a second time more slowly, and by the time she finished the second reading, she understood that the day she had just lived, the parking lot, the termination letter, the 6-hour drive north through the December dark, had not been the beginning of an ending. It had been the beginning of something else entirely. And her father, who had been gone for 3 years, had known it was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The letter began without preamble. Her father had never been a man for preamble. He had believed that the most respectful thing you could do for someone's attention was to use it carefully, and he had written accordingly, from the first line, with the directness of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to be said and was saying it without decoration. Nora, the letter began, if you're reading this, then you have come back to the house. I always believed you would. I did not know what would bring you back, whether it would be grief or trouble or simply the particular kind of tiredness that arrives when a life has been lived for too long on someone else's terms. I suspected it would be trouble, not because I doubted you, but because I knew the people around you, and I knew the kind of trouble they were capable of. She read that line twice. The people around you. Her father had been precise with language his entire life. He had not written the person. He had written the people, plural. She continued reading. I want to tell you what I found, and I want to tell you why I did not tell you at the time. The reason I did not tell you at the time is not a reason I am entirely comfortable with, and I want you to know that. I made a judgment about what you were ready to hear and when, and I may have been wrong. But I made it with the information I had and with the full weight of what I knew about you and about the situation, and I ask you to read what I have written before you decide how to feel about my silence. She set the letter down for a moment. The fire was burning steadily behind her. From the kitchen came the quiet sounds of Walt moving with the careful consideration of someone making himself useful without intruding. Outside, through the front window, the lake was invisible in the December dark, but she could feel its presence the way you feel the presence of large bodies of water, even when you cannot see them, a quality of space and cold air and depth that made itself known through the walls. She picked the letter back up. For years before he died, Edmund wrote, he had received a visit at the lakehouse from a man who identified himself as a representative of a land acquisition company based in Seattle. The man had been polite and professional and had made an inquiry about the property, specifically about whether Edmund had considered selling the lake frontage, which he described as having significant development potential given its position on the eastern shore and its access to the water. Edmund had declined, and the man had left, and Edmund had thought little of it beyond the mild irritation of an unsolicited approach. 6 weeks later, a different man had come. This one had not identified himself as a land acquisition representative. He had identified himself as someone conducting a regional property survey on behalf of a private investment group. He had asked questions about the property's boundaries, its water rights, its history of use. Edmund had answered some of these questions and had declined to answer others and had asked the man to leave when the questions began to feel like something more than a survey. She thought about whether this had been deliberate. She thought about it with the careful, methodical attention she brought to every complex problem, laying the available information out in sequence and examining it without the distortion of the anger that was present beneath the surface of her thinking, steady and real, but not yet the primary instrument. She was not ready to think with the anger. She needed to think clearly first. She continued reading. Edmund had done several things in response to what he had learned. He had consulted his own attorney, a woman in Coeur d'Alene named Lena Morrow who had handled his property affairs for 20 years and whom he trusted completely. He had commissioned an independent property assessment that included not just the market value of the lake house and the surrounding land, but a comprehensive evaluation of the property's natural resources and development potential. The assessment had returned findings that he had not anticipated and that had clarified, with uncomfortable precision, why a man like Victor Hale had been sending representatives to his door. The property contained something, not lithium, not minerals in the geological sense, but something equally significant in the specific context of the moment. The eastern shore position of the Callister property, combined with its water rights, which were old rights, established before the modern regulatory framework, and its particular topography, made it uniquely viable for a private water access and development corridor that a consortium of investors have been quietly assembling for years along that section of the lake. Without the Callister property, the corridor had a gap that could not be routed around. With it, The corridor was complete, and its value to the consortium was several times the assessed market value of the property itself. She thought about 22 years. She thought about the promotions that had come at intervals that felt earned, felt like recognition, felt like evidence that the work was visible and valued. She thought about how a man who knew the value of her father's property and wanted it would have managed someone in her position. He would have kept her close. He would have kept her invested. He would have kept her too busy and too committed and too embedded to look up long enough to see what was happening around her. She thought about the NDA on the conference room table that morning. The NDA she had not signed. She thought about why, specifically, a termination package would include a non-disclosure agreement, and what, specifically, Victor Hale would have needed her to agree not to disclose. She had assumed, in the parking lot, that it was standard practice, the kind of legal protection companies attach to separations as a matter of course. She did not assume that now. She picked up the letter and read the final paragraph. Edmund wrote that he had placed the relevant documents in the cedar box with the letter. He wrote that he had told Walt Pruitt enough of the situation to ensure the box was kept safely and delivered to her in person when she returned. He wrote that he had not told her any of this while he was alive, because he had watched her for 15 years building something inside that company and had not wanted to be the one to take it from her before she was ready to see it clearly for herself. He wrote, "I know my Nora, and I know that when the time comes, she will not need me to tell her what to do. She will already know. I only needed to make sure she had what she needed to do it." She folded the letter. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she called into the kitchen. "Walt," she said, "I think I need to see those documents now." Walt brought the documents to the front room without comment. He set them on the low table beside her father's armchair, and then returned to the kitchen with the same quiet tact he had shown since she arrived, the tact of someone who understood that what was happening in the front room required space and that the most useful thing he could offer was his absence from it. She heard him refilling the kettle. She heard the small sounds of someone making tea in a kitchen they knew well, moving without hesitation, opening the right cabinet on the first try. And she noted this detail, noted that Walt Pruitt moved through her father's kitchen with the familiarity of someone who had spent real time in it, and felt, rather than resented, this fact. Her father had not been alone in his last years. That was not a small thing. She turned to the documents. There were 3 of them, each in a separate envelope with her father's handwriting on the front, identifying the contents in his precise, economical way. Property assessment, legal correspondence, consortium records. She opened them in that order because it was the order her father had labeled them, and because she trusted his sequencing the way she had always trusted his sequencing, which was to say completely. The property assessment was 41 pages, prepared by a firm in Spokane that specialized in comprehensive resource and development evaluations. She did not read all 41 pages that night. She read the executive summary, which was 4 pages, and the section on water rights, which was 6 pages, and the concluding valuation, which was 2 pages. She read these sections with the focused attention of someone who has spent 22 years reading complex documents under time pressure and has developed the ability to extract the essential information from a document without losing the nuance of what surrounds it. The essential information was this. The Callister property's water rights predated the state regulatory framework by 40 years. They were among the oldest privately held water rights on the eastern shore of Hayden Lake. Combined with the property's specific topography, which included a natural inlet that provided sheltered, deep-water access unavailable at any other point along that section of the shore, these rights made the Callister land the single most strategically valuable parcel in a proposed private development corridor that had been in quiet assembly for nearly a decade. The assessment estimated the property's value to the corridor consortium at 4 to 6 times its standard market value, with a notation that this estimate was conservative given the corridor's dependency on the parcel and the absence of any viable alternative routing. She opened the consortium records envelope last. These were the most technical of the documents, acquisition maps and investment records and correspondence between consortium members that Edmund had obtained through means the documents did not explain and that she suspected had involved Walt Pruitt and his connections in the local community. The records showed the corridor's assembly over 8 years, parcel by parcel, each acquisition documented, each holdout noted. The Callister property appeared in every version of the corridor map, always marked in a different color from the acquired parcels, always annotated with the same word. Pending. Pending for 8 years. Her father's land had been marked pending in Victor Hale's investment records for 8 years while she sat in his company's offices and directed his operations and gave him the best hours of her professional days without once understanding that the man across the executive table from her had been trying, through channels she could not see, to take the one thing her father had spent his final years protecting. She placed the documents back in their envelopes. She placed the envelopes back in the cedar box. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the lid of the box, feeling the grain of the cedar under her palms, the same wood her father had used for the dock railing they had rebuilt together in August when she was 12. Then she picked up her phone. It was 11:23 in the evening. She did not hesitate over the hour. Some calls are not governed by the conventions of reasonable timing. She called Lena Morrow. She had found the number in the legal correspondence, printed on the firm's letterhead in the precise format of someone who expected to be contacted and wanted the contact to be easy. She did not know if Lena Morrow was still practicing. She did not know if the number was still current. She called it because her father had trusted this woman, and her father's judgment in these matters was, as the cedar box in her hands had just demonstrated, not a thing to be second-guessed. Nora looked across the front room at the fire, which was burning with the same steady, patient energy it had been burning with since she arrived, giving off heat without drama, lasting because the foundation had been laid correctly. "I'll have coffee ready," she said. She set the phone down on the table beside the cedar box. From the kitchen came the sound of Walt moving toward the front room, understanding from the quality of the silence that the phone call had concluded and that she might want company now or might not, and making himself available for either. She looked up when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression was the expression of someone who already knew the shape of what she had found and was waiting to see what she intended to do with it. "Did you know all of it?" she asked, not accusingly, simply wanting to understand the full picture before she moved forward. Because moving forward without the full picture was the thing she was done doing. She nodded. She thought about her father, who had understood the difference between protecting someone and deciding things for them, and who had spent the last years of his life doing the former without crossing into the latter. She had a meeting in the morning. She had documents and an attorney and the particular clarity that arrives when all available information has been gathered and organized and the next step is not uncertain but simply waiting to be taken. She understood everything she needed. The anger was still there, steady beneath the surface of her thinking. But above it, cleaner and more durable, was something else. Purpose. The purpose of someone who has identified what needs to be done and is ready, with everything she has, to do it. Lena Morrow arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. Nora had expected punctuality from the woman her father had trusted with his most consequential affairs, and Lena delivered it with the quiet confidence of someone for whom precision was not an effort but a disposition. She was 67 years old, compact and sharp-eyed, with the particular quality of an attorney who has spent 4 decades in rooms where the stakes were real and has developed, through that exposure, an economy of manner that communicated more through what it withheld than through what it expressed. She shook Nora's hand at the door and looked at her with the direct, assessing attention of someone taking careful inventory. And then she came inside and sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Nora offered without ceremony. Walt had left early that morning. He had appeared in the kitchen at 7 with his coat already on and had said, simply, that he thought the meeting ought to be private and that he would be at his own property if she needed him. She had thanked him with a sincerity that surprised her in its depth, because what she was thanking him for was not merely the fire and the 3 years of December visits, but the quality of his presence the previous evening, which had been exactly what it needed to be, available without being intrusive, steady without being heavy. The presence of someone who understood that the most useful thing you can offer a person in a difficult moment is the space to be in it without performing anything. For your benefit. Lena set her bag on the table and removed a folder, thick with documents organized with the same precision as Edmund's cedar box, and placed it between them. Before we go through these, she said, I want to tell you what your father asked me to tell you in person. Because there are things he wanted you to hear in a human voice rather than read off a page. Nora nodded. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and listened. What Edmund had been able to establish, Lena continued, was that Victor Hale had used his position as Nora's employer to access information about the Callister property that he had no legitimate right to access. Specifically, Hale and Drummond's HR and legal systems contained personal financial disclosures that Nora had submitted as part of the company's standard conflict of interest protocols, disclosures that included, as required, information about properties she owned or stood to inherit. Victor Hale had accessed those disclosures personally, outside the normal review process, on 3 separate occasions over 7 years. Edmund's attorney had obtained documentation of these access events through a contact at the company who had since left Hale and Drummond and was willing to provide a statement. Nora set her coffee mug down very carefully. She was thinking about the conflict of interest disclosures she had submitted every year, the routine form she had filled out with the thoroughness she brought to every administrative task, never imagining that the information in them was being used by the man she reported to as intelligence in a private acquisition strategy directed at her family's land. She was thinking about the NDA on the conference room table. She was thinking about it with the full force of what she now understood, which was that the NDA had not been standard practice. The NDA had been a specific and deliberate attempt to prevent her from connecting what had happened in that conference room to everything that had been happening in the years before it. Victor Hale had fired her because the corridor acquisition had stalled, because the consortium's financing timeline was under pressure, and because he had concluded that her continued presence at the company was no longer useful to his strategy and had become, with her father's property still unacquired, a liability. He had fired her in December because December was when deals closed and when pressure was highest, and when he had calculated that she would be too destabilized by the loss to look carefully at the timing. He had not known about the cedar box. He had not known about Lena Morrow. He had not known that Edmund Callister had spent the last years of his life building, with the same quiet precision he brought to dock railings and August mornings and the proper construction of a fire that would last, a case that was waiting for his daughter to arrive and open it. She told Lena about the NDA. Lena listened without interrupting, and when Nora finished, Lena was quiet for a moment in the particular way she had of processing information before responding, giving it the full weight of her attention before committing to a direction. Then she said, "The fact that you did not sign it is significant. It suggests he was not certain about the strength of his position. If he had been certain, he would not have needed you to sign anything." "What do we have?" Nora said. "Not in the emotional sense. In the legal sense. What is the actual shape of what we have?" Lena opened the folder. "We have," she said, "documented unauthorized access to your private financial disclosures by your employer over a period of 7 years. We have a pattern of coordinated acquisition attempts directed at your family's property that correlates with specific events in your employment history. We have consortium records that establish Victor Hale as a principal investor in a project that was directly dependent on acquiring property that belonged to your family. We have your father's documentation of unsolicited acquisition approaches. And we have a termination that occurred at a moment that is, when you lay the timeline out completely, very difficult to explain as coincidence." She paused. "What we are building," she said, "is not a simple wrongful termination case. What we are building is a pattern of conduct case. It will take time. It will require additional documentation. But the foundation your father laid is solid." She looked at Nora directly. "He was very thorough, your father. He understood that a case built on a solid foundation is a case that holds." Nora thought about Edmund at this kitchen table, drinking his coffee in the early morning with his newspaper, precise and unhurried and entirely at ease with himself and the world around him. She thought about what it had cost him in the final years of his life to carry this knowledge quietly and build this case carefully without telling his daughter what he was doing because he had judged, correctly, that she was not yet in a position to receive it. She paused. "What we are building," she said, "is not a simple wrongful termination case. What we are building is a pattern of conduct case. It will take time. It It will require additional documentation, but the foundation your father laid is solid. She looked at Nora directly. He was very thorough, your father. He understood that a case built on a solid foundation is a case that holds. Nora thought about Edmund at this kitchen table, drinking his coffee in the early morning with his newspaper, precise and unhurried and entirely at ease with himself and the world around him. She thought about what it had cost him, in the final years of his life, to carry this knowledge quietly and build this case carefully without telling his daughter what he was doing because he had judged, correctly, that she was not yet in a position to receive it. She thought about the debt she owed him, which was not the kind of debt that could be repaid, only honored, by doing exactly what he had prepared her to do, with exactly the precision and patience and clarity that he had known she was capable of. What we do first, she said. Lena picked up her pen. We document everything, she said, starting from the beginning, and then we build. The work began the following morning. Not the legal work, which was already in motion, but the other work, the work of the house itself, which Nora approached with the same methodical attention she had brought to every complex problem in her professional life, and that felt, applied here, in this context, with these materials and this particular cold December light coming through the windows, like something she had been saving herself for without knowing it. She started with the kitchen. It was a room her father had used most, had kept in the best condition through the years he lived there alone, and it was the room she understood best, both practically and in the deeper sense of a space that carried the accumulated weight of mornings and meals and the particular domestic rhythms of a life lived with care and attention. She cleaned it from ceiling to floor with the thoroughness of someone who finds in physical work a quality that no other kind of work provides, the immediate, visible, unambiguous evidence of effort made and progress achieved. Walt appeared on the second morning with a truck and 2 men he introduced as reliable and available. He had anticipated, without being asked, that the house would need more than 1 pair of hands, and had arranged accordingly. She looked at him for a moment when he arrived. This man her father had trusted with his house and his cedar box, and the 3 December visits that had kept the pipes from freezing and the house from feeling abandoned, and felt again the particular gratitude that goes beyond what thank you can adequately carry. They worked through the first week with the focused efficiency of people who have identified what needs to be done and are doing it without distraction. The dock needed 2 new planks and fresh waterproofing, work that was straightforward and satisfying in the way of things that have a clear beginning and a clear end. The boathouse roof had a section that had lifted in a winter storm and needed to be resecured, which Walt's men handled in an afternoon. She told Becca everything. She told her about the firing and the drive north and the smoke from the chimney and Walt Pruitt and the cedar box and the letter in her father's handwriting and the documents and Lena Morrow and the meeting at the kitchen table and the case that was now being built with the foundation Edmund had laid. She told her calmly and in order, the way her father had always told things, and she could hear in Becca's silence the particular quality of someone receiving information that reorganizes the architecture of what they thought they understood. There was anger in Becca's response, clean and immediate, the anger of a daughter on behalf of a mother, which Nora accepted without amplifying. She did not need the anger mirrored back to her. She had her own, steady and present beneath the surface of her days, and she had made the decision early in the process to use it as fuel rather than as weather, to let it power the work rather than determine the direction of it. "I'm coming up," Becca said. "I know you are," Nora said. "The guest room will be ready." She worked through the second and third weeks with a rhythm that surprised her in its naturalness, as though the house had always known the pace at which she needed to move through it and was simply making that pace available to her. Mornings were for the physical work, the repairs, and the cleaning and the gradual restoration of each room to something that was not merely functional but inhabited, marked by the presence of someone who intended to be there and had thought carefully about what that presence required. Afternoons were for Lena. They spoke every other day, sometimes at the kitchen table when Lena drove up from Coeur d'Alene, sometimes by phone when the distance made the drive impractical. The case was developing with the methodical momentum of something built on solid ground. The documentation of Victor Hale's unauthorized access to her financial disclosures had been expanded by a second former Hale and Drummond employee who had come forward after learning through professional channels that an investigation was underway. The consortium records her father had preserved were being authenticated by a specialist Lena had retained in Seattle. The pattern of conduct, laid out in the timeline Lena had constructed from Edmund's documents and Nora's own recollections of her 22 years at the company, was becoming visible with the clarity of something that had always been there and was now simply being properly lit. Becca arrived on a Friday evening in the second week with her partner James and a truck full of things she had decided her mother needed: extra blankets, good coffee, cast iron pan. She said the kitchen was incomplete without, and the particular energy of someone who has arrived at a place they immediately understand as significant. James was quiet and observant, with the quality Nora looked for in the people her daughter chose, the quality of someone who listens with genuine attention and speaks with genuine intention. He helped Walt's men with the dock work on Saturday morning without being asked, and by Saturday afternoon had the particular ease of someone who has found their place in a situation and settled into it without requiring direction. They cooked together that evening, all four of them, in the kitchen her father had kept in working order through the years he lived there alone. Walt had been invited and had accepted with a brief, unelaborated acceptance of someone who does not make social decisions complicated. They ate at the table where Edmund had eaten his solitary breakfast for 3 years after his wife died, and his daughter's visits became less frequent. And the conversation was the kind that happens when people who are connected by something real are gathered in a place that has the weight of history behind it and the feeling of a good future ahead. After dinner, when Walt and James had moved to the front room, Becca sat across from her mother at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and was quiet for a moment in the way she had always been quiet before saying something she had thought carefully about. "You look like yourself," she said finally. "More than I have seen in years." Nora thought about this. "I think I had forgotten what that felt like," she said, "being entirely myself, without the continuous work of being what someone else needed me to be." Becca looked at her with the direct, clear attention that was the quality Nora was most proud of having somehow given her. The legal case concluded in the spring. Not quickly, because cases built on solid foundations do not move quickly. They move correctly, which is a different thing entirely. And Lena Mora was a woman who understood the difference with the clarity of someone who has spent 4 decades building things that hold. The proceedings ran their course through January and February and into March, developing with the methodical momentum of something that has been properly constructed and is now simply doing what properly constructed things do, which is to stand up under examination and remain standing. Victor Hale had retained a significant legal team. This had not surprised Nora. A man with his resources and his exposure would have retained the best available defense, and she had expected it and had discussed it with Lena early in the process, and Lena had received the information with the calm of someone who has faced significant legal teams before and understands that the quality of a case is not determined by the resources arrayed against it, but by the solidity of its foundation. The foundation was solid. Edmund had made sure of that. The unauthorized access to her personal financial disclosures was documented and irrefutable. The pattern of conduct connecting those access events to the consortium's acquisition timeline was established through the records her father had preserved and the testimony of the 2 former Hale and Drummond employees who had come forward. The termination, examined in the full context of what the timeline revealed, was demonstrated to be not a restructuring, but a strategic action taken to protect Victor Hale's position at a moment when the corridor acquisition had stalled and Nora's continued presence at the company had become inconvenient to his strategy. The outcome was what Lena had indicated it would likely be, measured in the careful language of someone who does not promise results but has substantial experience with precedent. Significant financial penalties. A judgment against Hale and Drummond Associates that would take years to satisfy. Consequences proportionate to what the record showed. Nora read Lena's summary of the outcome on a Tuesday morning at her father's kitchen table, with her coffee cooling beside her and the early spring light coming through the window that looked out over the dock and the lake beyond. She read it once, carefully, and then she filed it in the cedar box beside her father's letter and the geological assessment and the consortium records, and she did not return to it. It was finished, and it was accurate, and she was done attending to it. the water rights, and the property had been formally secured through the legal tripwire Edmund had established with Lena's help in the final years of his life. No claim could be filed, no acquisition attempted, no approach made without triggering the legal protections he had put in place with the same quiet thoroughness he had brought to everything else. The Corridor Consortium had dissolved in February when the financing timeline collapsed under the weight of the investigation. The Callister property remained exactly what it had always been, hers, unencumbered and waiting. She had spent the winter exploring the development options for the water access the property contained, not sale. She had never considered sale, but structures that would allow the property to remain in her ownership, while its unique position on the eastern shore was used in a way that was consistent with its preservation. Lena had connected her with a conservation attorney in Boise who specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement, and together they had identified a partnership with a regional land trust that would protect the ecological character of the shoreline while generating a sustainable income from the carefully managed water access rights. The first payment from the arrangement arrived in April, and Nora looked at the figure on the statement and sat with it for a moment, and then called Becca. "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing," she said. "He always did," Becca said. The house by spring was something that the word restoration did not fully capture. It was not merely restored. It was better than it had been, because Nora had brought to it not just the craft of repair, but the full attention of someone who understood what she was doing and why. The dock was solid and newly planked and caught the April light off the lake in the way her father's dock had always caught it, which was the way she had been seeing it in her memory for 30 years without knowing she was seeing it. The boathouse was sound. The interior of the house had the quality of space that has been attended to by someone who loves it, which is a different quality from space that has merely been maintained. She had begun, in the afternoons, to write. Not for any particular audience, not with any particular destination in mind, but because she had discovered in the quiet of the lakehouse winters a voice she had not known she possessed, a way of setting down what she had experienced and what she had learned from it that had the quality of clarity and that gave her, in the giving of it, something she had not expected, which was the sense that the experience itself had been transformed by the act of articulating it into something with shape and meaning and the possibility of being useful to someone else. Becca read the first pages on a visit in March and sat quietly for a long time after finishing. Then she looked at her mother with the direct, clear attention that was the quality Nora was most proud of having given her and said, "You should keep going." So she kept going. Victor Hale she heard about in the way that information travels, through Lena's professional updates, and through the simple reality that a man whose pattern of conduct has been fully documented and adjudicated does not remain comfortably invisible. He had resigned from Hale and Drummond in January. The company was under new management and had, according to Lena's contacts, begun the process of re-examining several of its employment practices. She received this information without dwelling on it. It was accurate, and it was finished, and it belonged to the part of the story that was behind her. She was 53 years old, and she was, for the first time in as long as she could precisely remember, entirely herself. Not a version of herself adjusted to someone else's requirements. Not a self managed down to fit inside someone else's comfort and convenience and strategy. Simply herself, in the full and specific sense of a person who has found, through the complete loss of what she thought she had, the thing she actually had all along. Her father had known this about her. He had preserved the conditions for it with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. The dock railing and the cedar box, and the 18 years of friendship with a neighbor he had trusted to keep a fire burning in December. On every morning when she sat at his table with her coffee and looked out at the lake and the light moving across it, she felt the particular quality of his love, which was not the love that announces itself, but the love that builds something solid and trust that the person it was built for will find their way to it when they are ready. She had found her way to it. She was ready. If you have ever been let go from something you gave everything to, and discovered in the silence that followed that the loss had made room for the life that was always meant to be yours. If you have ever had a parent who loved you in the quiet way, the building way, the way that prepares rather than pronounces. If you have ever driven towards something without knowing exactly what it was and arrived to find that it had been waiting for you all along, this story belongs to you. Because Nora Callister did not survive Victor Hale's betrayal. She outlasted it. And there's a difference. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the smoke rising from the chimney of a place you thought was empty might not be a warning. It might be a welcome. That what your father built for you, quietly and precisely and with full faith in who you are, is solid ground. And that the best chapters of a life are sometimes the ones that begin with losing everything you thought you were. We are so grateful you walked this road with us today. We will see you in the next story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.